I'm John Batchelor. Gordon Chang, Forbes.com contributors here with me, and we're exploring the possibility, the probability of armed conflict in the South China Sea between the PLA Navy, the rising power of the 21st century, and the United States Navy, the world power, the empire since the 20th century. We're joined now by Scott Harold, a full political scientist, Rand Corporation. We're looking at this conflict zone, the South China Sea, but also Scott's just back from Beijing, conversations about cyber security, conversations about conflict. Scott, a very good evening to you. I want to start in general, whether there was an atmosphere of conflict, of inevitability, of any of those world historical, philosophical moments when you were in Beijing. Is Beijing thinking, are the intellectuals of China thinking or postulating that it could come to conflict with the United States? Good evening to you.
Good evening, John and Gordon, and John, to your listeners around the world. When we were in Beijing 2 weeks ago, the mood was certainly one of a China characterized by a high degree of self-confidence, self-righteousness, and at times more than a touch of swagger. But we also did talk to individuals who were much more calm, collected, even some who were highly critical of their own government, saying that the tensions that were plaguing Asia were largely the result of government policies driven by Beijing rather senselessly. So we heard a range of viewpoints. Of course, the official and the think tank viewpoints were almost uniformly critical of the United States and its allies, placing the blame for South China Sea tensions, for example, on alternately the U.S. or U.S. allies.
Scott, there have been times when China has gone and been very, very provocative, even for months, and then there have been moments where they have pulled back and have been much more reasonable, much more cooperative, trying to work with the international community. On Monday, we saw the Global Times editorial talking about the inevitability of war unless the United States backed down. Yesterday was the military's white paper on strategy, which was actually quite provocative in parts. Are we going to see another pivot in China's foreign policy and posture towards the South China Sea where they pull back? Or are they at a point where they can't back down? Where do you see this?
You know, Gordon, it's an excellent question. It's very hard to see anything that leads Beijing to call a full stop to construction in the South China Sea. You know, they've painted themselves a bit into a corner here where they've laid a lot of resources out to do this. Of course, this was not something that they could have just done as woke up one morning and decided to do this. There was a lot of thought and planning that went into this. You've got a lot of vessels down there. It costs an awful lot of money to do this. So I don't see them planning to stop. The next question is, how do they plan to use it? We've just seen reports come out today that suggest that China may be emplacing weapons on the artificial islands. If they do that, that would be a very unhelpful and untoward step. You know, they've also at times talked about trying to frame this in a much more positive light as an aid to fishermen, as a navigational aid. Of course, that's intended to help legitimate their claims, but all of this is also being driven by the recognition that in Beijing that the Philippines' submission to the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea is probably going to find sometime later this year that China's 9-line claim is illegitimate. You can't simply lay claim to something that you do not have control over and have no historical claims to, and thereby take it. So I think they're trying to create facts on the water on the principle that possession is 9/10 of the law. And if you're going to ignore the International Tribunal, you might as well also do this so as to reinforce your claims.
So, Scott, I ask you to maybe speculate a little bit. Just give us, our listeners, your views on this. Who is making the decisions in Beijing? It's obviously not some of the more reasonable think tank people that you've been speaking to. Who is actually making the decision to destroy all this coral, build these islands, and to take a pretty provocative attitude?
Well, you know, this is one of the problems with the opacity of the Chinese regime. no one knows for sure, but I think that it's reasonable to suspect that the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, the chairman of the Central Military Commission, State President Xi Jinping, probably is the primary individual with whom responsibility lies for this. He has talked about being a much more proactive leader, talked about China adopting a strategy of striving for achievement. He has talked in very vivid, masculine, macho terms about the reasons for the downfall of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and his unwillingness to preside over the downfall of the Chinese Communist Party. So I think that ultimately we have to assume that the drivers for the decisions to bulk up China's physical presence in the South China Sea and to create these facts on the water derives from Chairman Xi. He is, at the end of the day, the chairman of every meaningful leading small group, those being the coordinating organizations within the peak of the party state that provide guidance on big policy issues like this. And it's unimaginable that these kinds of actions are being taken against his wishes. And final note to say is that it's worth remembering we're in probably the most tense political environment at the top of the Chinese Communist Party in over 2 decades. And in that environment, the only smart move for Xi Jinping to adopt is the most hardline position so that he could never be criticized as being too soft on foreigners.
We just have 30 seconds, and this, I don't want to make it too elaborate. So your sense of proportion right now, having come back from Beijing, I do not hear a climb-down position. So that means the Chinese are prepared for conflict with the United States. Is that correct? That's where we are now. Everybody's prepared for the conflict.
I think we might be a little bit premature to say that the Chinese are ready for conflict. I think they're ready for confrontation. Mm-hmm. I think that they are prepared to engage in a game of risk. And at the end of the day, the most vulnerable or weakest links in that game are probably the Vietnamese, followed by the Filipinos. The Vietnamese don't have an external ally, and the Filipinos are allied to us but are so weak that they may represent the weakest link in the chain.
Scott Harold, Rand Corporation, full political scientist, Gordon Chang of Forbes.com contributor. I'm John Batchelor.